Amidst all the talk of revolution and resistance, there's perhaps one group that could teach us more than any other: the Zapatistas. It's now the 20th year of the Zapatista civil resistance movement, which is made up primarily of indigenous Mexicans and led by the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. And while the movement is characterized by leftist philosophies, members reject any political classification, seeking only indigenous autonomy over their land and resources. Well, recently, the Mexican government-sanctioned murder of teacher Jose Luis Solis Lopez, better known as Compañero Galeano, and the decision by Zapatista leader Subcomandante Marcos to step down from his role has sent shockwaves through the movement. And once again, it's brought attention to the continued struggle for indigenous rights in Mexico. So to help me go over this story in a larger context of the Zapatista movement, I was joined earlier by Bhaskar Sunkara, founding editor of the magazine Jacobin. I first asked him about how the Zapatista movement got onto the scene.
The Zapatistas first really emerged with the decline of the initial ruling party in Mexico, the PRI, which had ruled Mexico since the Mexican Revolution. And it really emerged in the context of the decline of this institutional force, the PRI, and then also the institution of NAFTA and other free trade agreements that really had an impact on the rural poor, small farmers, other petty proprietors in Chiapas and elsewhere in Mexico.
What is it about NAFTA that has driven such a strong revolt, particularly from the indigenous community?
Well, not only is unregulated free trade something that inherently will hurt the weakest and most vulnerable in society. In the U.S., we didn't even have real free trade. We had something even worse, where U.S. farmers and other people received subsidies from their government, while at the same time imposing a regime on Mexican farmers and other indigenous farmers and other people that forced them to relinquish subsidies. So not only were they now competing with an even wider world market, they were doing so on a very uneven terrain. So beyond not even having the equipment and the capital that U.S. farmers had, they were given no support or had their support stripped away almost overnight. So it was really, really dislocating.
I think there's been a lot of disinformation about the Zapatistas here in the U.S., and I wanted to get just a sense from you on the definition of the ideology that the group has. I mean, we know that they're a counterforce to neoliberalism, but how would you just define their ideology?
Right, so I would call the Zapatistas autonomous Marxists of some point. I know Marxist is a word that would scare a lot of people, but essentially they're non-hierarchical, or at the very least, they question and resist hierarchies. They're structured in such a way where they do have an organizational structure, but they strive to make their interactions within the movement and also interactions with the community as open and transparent, as non-hierarchical as possible. They aimed for the collectivization of basic social goods. They fought for the recognition of indigenous rights and past indigenous suffering, but also just very basic bread and butter things. They wanted literacy. They wanted proper sanitation and water. They wanted the government to pay attention to them. So ideologically, I would put them in a Marxist camp, but one that drifts a little bit close to anarchism in that, these people weren't trying to seize the Mexican state and impose some sort of socialist dictatorship. They were really more narrowly focused on these local concerns, and they really were attempting to make sure that their demands were rooted in the needs of the larger indigenous communities in which they were rooted.
The movement initially emphasized the necessity of armed struggle. It's changed quite a bit since. I was wondering if you can outline how that's evolved.
I would say that their rejection, though, of armed tactics is more of a tactical thing rather than some sort of moral or ethical rejection of it. They weren't going around bombing buildings. These aren't urban terrorists. They're far from, the Shining Path in Peru or other forces in the region. In the past, in the 70s and 80s, and the right often used to compare it to them, and completely without merit. Really, their initial arms stage was more of a symbolic thing. They were seizing local buildings. They were making a big display of themselves. They made sure that the army And as a result, Mexican society at large paid attention to their demands. Now, in conditions today, it makes less sense to them, but I don't think there's been a major shift, nor do I think they have much to apologize for their initial early years. They weren't going around killing people.
Something else notable about the movement is its inclusion of women. I was wondering if you could talk about the Zapatista view on women's rights and the role that women play in the group.
Right. What's something about the Zapatistas which is very interesting is that even though Subcomandante Marcos donned his mask and many other Zapatistas were these striking, male figures. And the thing about Marcos is that he was often commented on how handsome he was, even though he was wearing a mask. Maybe it was a strong jawline or something. But despite this romanticism, which really was similar to romanticisms around Che Guevara and other Latin American guerrillas in their days, they really placed a big emphasis on being diverse and not only rhetorically advocating for the needs of local indigenous women and in favor of things like access to reproductive rights and so on, but also frontlining many female members of the Zapatistas. And I think that's something that the Latin American left needs to do more of, and the Zapatistas are a really good example of a generational shift in the right direction.
Let's talk about these autonomous municipalities. This is amazing. They've built 32 autonomous municipalities not recognized by the government. Give us a sense of how they were able to do this. I mean, speaking of Occupy, look at what happened here. How did this happen in Mexico, and how do they currently operate?
I do think that one thing the Zapatistas did very well, which is an example for all of this, is they slowly built support in their communities, the communities they were embedded. Many of them, the initial Zapatista leadership, or at least some prominent members, weren't actually from Chiapas. They were leftists who came out of movements around Mexico City in the 60s and 70s and slowly made their way to Chiapas, doing various organizing and other work. But they made sure that they were building consensus and majority support for their actions and building a popular base. So the municipalities, we kind of see them as something that can just happen overnight. Like sometimes we even interpreted Occupy that way, as encampments sprout out overnight. Nobody really stops and reflects on the slow, laborious work of building long-term organizations, building structures, propagating and building support, and really educating people about radical views. So the old line in 20th century socialism was educate, organize, agitate. I feel like to some extent the left today has kind of flipped that around. It's become agitate, agitate, agitate. The Zapatistas are very good at remembering the first two parts of that equation.
Chris Hedges recently wrote an article entitled, "We Must All Become Zapatistas." I wanted to read you a quote from that where he said, "The Zapatistas the most important resistance movement of the last 2 decades. They understood that corporate capitalism has launched a war against us. They showed us how to fight back." Do you agree with Hedges' assessment here? And what can the Zapatistas teach the rest of the world?
Well, this might be a bit ironic coming from a strong supporter of the Zapatistas, but I actually completely disagree with Chris Hedges there. I think that the whole point of the Zapatistas, they adapted to local conditions. They were rooted in their communities. They adapted their tactics to the situation that they were in. So I think we could draw inspiration from the Zapatistas in some vague sense. In the same way we could draw inspiration from the Chicago Teachers Union or from other forces. But even to say we should be Zapatistas, I think that's actually getting into the fetishization of the veneer, the aesthetics, the persona that Subcomandante Marcos was talking about. So I actually think that one of the most important things for the left in America and the left in the rest of the developed world is to consider the unique situation that we're dealing with in advanced capitalist countries and to figure out how to root our critiques in the material needs of working class people and how to take them from where they are now to a direction where they recognize that the problem isn't just a crony capitalism. It isn't just Goldman Sachs. The problem is deeper and more structural. It's a system that deprives people of autonomy and forces them to exploit themselves in the workplace for other people's profits. So obviously the Zapatistas would agree with that sentiment, but tactically, I think we have solidarity to offer them. We have things we can do to help them in their struggles, and there's things they can do to help us in our struggles. But I wouldn't say that there's any more relevance to our day-to-day organizing than that.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar Sunkara. Really, really appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Amidst all the talk of revolution and resistance, there's perhaps one group that could teach us more than any other, the Zapatistas. It's now the 20th year of the Zapatista civil resistance movement, which is made up primarily of indigenous men.
There are other petty proprietors in Chiapas and elsewhere in Mexico.
What is it about NAFTA that has driven such a strong revolt, particularly from the indigenous community?
Well, not only is unregulated free trade something that inherently will hurt the weakest and most vulnerable in society. In the U.S., we didn't even have real free trade. We had
Mexicans and led by the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. And while the movement is characterized by leftist philosophies, members reject any political classification, seeking only indigenous autonomy over their land and resources. Well, recently, the Mexican government-sanctioned murder of teacher Jose Luis Solis Lopez, better known as Compañero Galeano, and the decision by Zapatista leader Subcomandante Marcos to step down from his...
with the decline of the initial ruling party in Mexico, the PRI, which had ruled Mexico since the Mexican Revolution. And it really emerged in the context of the decline of this institutional force, the PRI, and then also the institution of NAFTA and other free trade agreements that really had an impact on the rural poor, small farmers.
His role has sent shockwaves through the movement. And once again, it's brought attention to the continued struggle for indigenous rights in Mexico. So to help me go over this story in a larger context of the Zapatista movement, I was joined earlier by Bhaskar Sunkara, founding editor of the magazine, Jacobin. I first asked him about how the Zapatista movement got onto the scene.
The Zapatistas first really emerged